Britain's Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has been elected to become the next British Prime Minister. Last week, Truss beat her rival, Rishi Sunak, following the resignation of former Prime Minister Boris Johnson in July. Truss, a member of Britain's Conservative Party and known for being a war hawk, will officially become Prime Minister on Tuesday, and is only the third female to hold that position in the United Kingdom.
Well, here to discuss what this new leadership in one of the U.S.'s closest allies means is reporter for The Hill, Niall Stanage, and news editor at antiwar.com, Dave DeCamp. Welcome to you both.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
So, Niall, I want to start with you. Describe to us Liz Truss a little bit. Where did she come from? What are her views? What is her place within the Conservative Party?
So she's a small C Conservative as well as a large C Conservative Party politician. She clearly hails from the right of the party. That wasn't always the case. One of the more intriguing things about her was that in her youth she was, by British standards, quite left-wing. She was anti-monarchy. She was part of the Liberal Democrats, which is kind of a centrist party in Britain, but in adulthood has been a Conservative all her life and pretty much to the right of the party, both on foreign affairs and in terms of things like economic issues.
So what was it that was appealing to her in this particular context in the United Kingdom? What is the cultural appetite right now that causes people to want to choose a prime minister that is, to your point, to the right of the country?
Well, it's highly questionable whether they do want that, and it is to do with the mechanics of Conservative Party elections, which get thrown to the membership of the Conservative Party to decide. To make a long story short, the Conservative MPs break it down to a two-person field, then goes to the membership of the Conservative Party. The membership of the Conservative Party is much whiter, older and richer than the population at large. So Liz Truss has been selected by them as their leader and is thus Prime Minister. The Conservative Party is now lagging the Labour Party for the first time in years by a quite significant distance in the polls.
So, Dave, I've seen some people offer some feedback online, and they point to this. They say that the unions that are frustrated and opposing this turn require more of a majority vote and have more legitimacy than someone like Truss. Can you speak to some of the public response to this leadership change?
Yeah, well, it seems like the people in the UK, as Neil mentioned, didn't really have much of a say in this election. From what I understand, there's only about 80,000 members of the Conservative Party that voted, which is a very small portion of Britain's population. And now they're not going to have a proper election until at least 2025, from how I understand it. So I think there is a lot of people unhappy that, they traded Boris Johnson for somebody that seems even more to the right.
And you were specifically critical. You wrote critically of Truss on her foreign policy views. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so since Russia invaded Ukraine, Liz Truss, as the British Foreign Secretary, has been one of the most hawkish Western officials. And that's saying a lot. When Russia first invaded, she said that she supported Britons going to fight in Ukraine voluntarily as volunteers in the Foreign Legion that they set up. She's said that, there shouldn't be any negotiations. She's called for a strategic defeat of Russian President Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, which is saying a lot. And also, according to a recent report from the Financial Times, she believes that the U.S. isn't taking a hard enough line on Russia, which, the U.S. has committed tens of billions of dollars to funding this war on Russia's border, with the latest $13.7 billion that President Biden asked Congress for. That will bring the funds to about $66 billion. And now that's not all military aid. It's being spent in many different ways. A lot of it's going straight to the Pentagon, but still, the UK so far has allocated about $2.8 billion in all aid. So it really dwarfs the amount. So she's standing there saying that the US has to take a harder line. I think that's pretty concerning. And she is inheriting a Britain that is very close to being at war with Russia.
And it's interesting because, in the U.S., to the extent there's any opposition to a more kind of hawkish posture on Ukraine, Russia, that opposition, the political part of that opposition is mostly from conservatives, is mostly from some Republican members of the House. Obviously, there are left-wing people who are against it too, but in general, right now, actually, the Republican Party, the very conservative people, are the kind of anti-intervention on Russia, Ukraine. So that's very interesting to compare here domestically with the UK, which will now have a more conservative prime minister, but someone who is kind of more contrary to what US conservatives think about Ukraine, Russia.
Yeah, and I think it's a small portion of American right-wingers, at least, that are represented in Congress that are really against this war in Ukraine. For the most part, still sort of the mainstream Republican view is that the U.S. should be supporting Ukraine. And I would be surprised on the national level. I mean, if the next president is Republican, I would be surprised to see really a change in this policy. And what Liz Truss, like I mentioned, she is inheriting a Britain that's almost at war with Russia that, from Moscow's view, I mean, could be considered at war. There was a reporting in the Times of London back in April that British Special Air Service troops are on the ground in Ukraine, training Ukrainian troops. And then we saw more reporting from the New York Times at the end of June that said, yes, there's British Special Forces in Ukraine. And that report also revealed that there was CIA on the ground, which wasn't much of a surprise. More of the story was that they told the media. But this Liz Truss, ultra hawk, as I call her, she's inheriting a very dangerous situation. And she made it clear in a recent town hall when she was asked how would she feel if she had to launch a nuclear weapon. And what the person that asked the question said, it would mean global annihilation. And she said, I'm ready to do it. And when asked again, well, how will you feel? She just said, I'm ready. And everybody applauded. So I think that's pretty concerning.
She must have a key to the bunker.
Well, like you said, Niall, despite growing up in a left-leaning household with parents who were strongly anti-nuclear, Truss took on a much different view in a recent town hall, seeming to be very much in favor of nuclear weapons. Here is that clip.
You'll be ushered into a room, very privately at number 10. Will be laid out in front of you what are called the letters of last resort, your orders to our Trident boat captain on whether you, Prime Minister Liz Truss, is giving the order to unleash our nuclear weapons. It would mean global annihilation. I won't ask you, would you press the button? You will say yes. But faced with that task, I would feel physically sick. How does that thought make you feel?
I think it's an important duty of the Prime Minister. I'm ready to do that.
I asked how it would make you feel.
I'm ready to do it.
Yeah, I mean, what do you make of that, Niall? Because, look, she is inheriting a country that, as Robbie has put it, is on, the brink of war. She ran on tax cuts for the rich, is affiliated with a war on trade unions, and people have accused her of not having a real plan for the high energy costs in the country and obviously around the world here as well. At the same time that the UK has a very different experience with labor and activism than we have in the United States. And many of us look to the transit strikes and the like that have been going on, discussions about a general strike, jealously almost, because we feel as though there's a lack of accountability for our own politicians because we don't have that level of labor energy. We're looking at the UK where there is that level of labor energy, but it doesn't seem to have stopped there being a prime minister who is so antagonistic to those interests that are represented by the labor force. So my question to you is whether you think that there will be a possibility of pushing her on any of these policy issues that seem so out of step with the activism that's happening in the country right now.
I mean, I think there's a couple of points there, Brianna. Certainly the political centre of gravity in the United Kingdom is at least a few notches further to the left than it is here in the US. Now, Liz Truss has very expressly and explicitly modelled herself on Margaret Thatcher, who was not only a deeply conservative person, but to your point, Robbie, was much more identified with that kind of interventionist foreign policy. And there was the Falklands War when I was a kid. She was very allied with Ronald Reagan. So Liz Truss is trying to present herself in that way. Having said all of that, you raised the issue of energy costs. Those are spiralling way out of control in Britain. they are very closely linked, for obvious reasons, to the Ukraine crisis and to Russian energy. And we understand that Liz Truss is going to propose a cap on energy costs, which will be subvented or subsidised by the taxpayer at a cost they think of around £90 billion, so more than $100 billion. That's the kind of policy that I don't think you would see in the United States, even as it is coming from a very, as I say, small c and large c Conservative Prime Minister.
Yeah, that's right. We had Richard Wolff, Marxist economist, on the show recently, and he talks about price caps, but he is pretty much the only one who talks about it, even though he alludes to the fact that Nixon very famously implemented price tax, and that is caps rather, and that is a conservative intervention. In the current political space, it's absolutely not to be mentioned by anyone in either party right now.
Right, completely off the table in US politics, but still on the table in British politics.
Well, Niall, David, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.